Thank you for coming. Actually, before I wanted to be a pirate, I wanted to be an Indian, by which I mean a Native American. And curiously, it was the subject English that made me decide that. In response to an infant school homework exercise in composition, which asked the very imaginative and highly theoretical question, what do you want to be when you grow up? Hollywood made Indians seem much more deserving of empathy than cowboys. And living in a small bush town with bandicoots scampering and other kids crawling through the lantana maze of tunnels that we'd built in the wilderness beyond our back garden, or more correctly, the movable frontier of our backyard, I was drawn by the call of the wild. I heard that call from the bush up the back and from the lake across the road, morning and night, but also from a little library nearby, because my earliest conception of being wild came from literature. From Hans Christian Andersen's Tale of the Wild Swans, who were really children cast under a magic spell that only permits them to return to human form at night. From fairy tale, I learned the secrets of transformation, where human and non-human were interchangeable. My favourite character at this stage was the boy who became a swan, but whose final transformation occurs in reverse, restoring him to being human, but incompletely so, a boy with one arm and one wing. Each day I set out for school with a carefully combed wave of hair conjured up by my mother with a magic comb. Dressed in a clean and neatly ironed school uniform, I returned home after the tribal warfare of the playground, with shirt buttons missing, tufts of hair torn out in battle, or if not, then in a deliberate mess. By a quirk of serendipity, the house of my future colleague Julian Croft's grandparents was close by, and he was a frequent visitor to the area, swimming, fishing, and sailing through his school holidays. We met much later at the various conferences of the Association for the Study of Australian Literature, of which he was a founder, and through its journal, Notes and Furfies, which he co-edited, as I did after him. The university has now had 2 chairs in English in succession, whose formative experiences not only overlapped, but played out within 10 houses of each other. Yet Julian was a visitor, an outsider of sorts, and I belonged to the inner circle of that tight little mining community on the lakeshore. Our collaboration, when we decided eventually to research and write about that community, looking back with an undeniable nostalgia of future shock, we chose to draw upon participant-observer social anthropology as seemed appropriate to the split consciousness of our perspective. We chose industrial pastoral to suggest the enigma of a time and space before the tragedy of the modern industrial city, when industrial and rural life had briefly coincided. It seemed possible then to live in one world and lose yourself in another, more or less at the same time. And this describes perfectly my attraction to literature in my boyhood. Life and literature were continuous, like the garden and the lantana maze, the collective rituals of the mining culture and the individual adventures of the bush and the lake. Breathing in, breathing out. Hybridity in horticulture refers to the crossbreeding of 2 species by grafting or cross-pollination to form a third or different species. In literary and cultural studies too, this is now a key term, meaning the creation of transcultural forms within the contact zone produced by colonisation. I saw no reason why I couldn't be both Blackfoot and Blackbeard. After all, when the Blackfoot nation first encountered the horses of the Great Plains in the early 18th century, they called them elk dogs, thinking that they were some hybrid form of dog and deer. My sense of identity then, as many literary and cultural theorists will describe it today, was performative. It was interactive, like those children's books, where the page is cut so you can turn it in sections, producing an entirely different assemblage of the image every time. This method, borrowed from the visual arts of course, has a long pedigree. As it applies to literature, it's mostly associated with the influence of Dadaism from the 1920s and the cut-up techniques of William Burroughs in the 1950s, all of which can be seen as forerunners of today's sampling and remixing techniques. Yet in their own way, the mining men of the local community were also shapeshifters. They went to work white, they dived down under the ground to dig for coal, the great buried treasure of the northern coalfields, and when they resurfaced, they were black. And this would happen every day. In the library, though, the miners and their families were absent, both in the flesh and on the shelves. The adventure and survival stories I overheard at the pit, tramping down to the coalface with the men in my school holidays, or up on the pit top, sitting around the stove with the carpenters and the welders in the workshop, those stories constituted a whole other order of literature. Tales of underground floods and explosions, roof falls, riots, scabs, horses and dogs, family and community. I crossed over to the adult side of the library, looking for those stories, but they weren't there either. This absence led to a lifelong impression on me of the limits of mainstream literature. And really looking back, this became the motive behind my career, reading and teaching English as a way to reveal, explain, and creatively undo, if possible, the structures of exclusion and oppression. While I found no working class literature in the public library, however, I did find a whole other world, far removed from the industrial pasture of my immediate surroundings. Some places in it so disturbing and yet strangely inviting that I would one day feel compelled to go there and be there in the flesh, where the characters of my literary imagination had been placed by their authors. After my first degree, as Irish told you, I went to St. Petersburg, for example, where the impoverished ex-law student Raskolnikov embarks upon a hideous murder, believing he has every right to do so, and just to prove that he can, as an act of pure destruction, intended as the ultimate act of creation. But by the time I got there, it was called Leningrad. Still, I could still trace the path of Dostoevsky's anti-hero through the streets of the old town. I went to other places I had encountered on the far side of the library too. Kiev, where Bernard Mullenwood's fixer, a carpenter like my own grandfather, had been falsely accused of the ritual murder of a Christian child. Moscow, centre point of Solzhenitsyn's first circuit, the experimental design bureau of the Soviet labour camps, the Gulag archipelago, and home to the enemies of the state. I crossed the steppes to Tashkent, the legendary city of the military mastermind Tamerlane, and later the British master spy, Colonel Frederick Bailey, one of the last protagonists of the Great Game, for me, synonymous with Kipling's kin. Bailey, under another name, had managed to infiltrate the Bolshevik secret police, only to be dispatched to Bukhara to arrest himself. My own journey through English literature to Bukhara and Samarkand, however, was inspired by the Oriental otherness of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Pirate from the Persian by Edward Fitzgerald, and leading the Argentinian writer Jorge Borges to his theory of translation as an infinite repertoire of possibilities. So here we are, full circle, back to the idea of hybridity, the creation of a new transcultural form within the contact zone produced by colonisation. For as Borges tells it, the author of the English Rubaiyat is neither the Persian astronomer who condescends to write poetry, nor the eccentric Englishman who peruses Oriental and Hispanic books without completely understanding them, but an extraordinary poet who does not resemble either of them, and who emerges from the fortuitous conjunction of both. The first of Borges' own stories to be translated into English was The Garden of Forking Paths, which explores the idea of the book as a maze, capable of virtually infinite readings. This story, written before the birth of the computer, is now seen as an important forerunner to the development of hypertext fiction, perhaps even to Hugh Everett's many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. In hypertext fiction, it's hard to know where you are at any given moment, because the moment that you're in has no history and no expectation of the future. In other words, you have to choose a story, to make your past, and to give yourself an expectation of the future. Like the story that I've just told you of the working class boy who followed the path of his reading of the Soviet Union. And with that story, I could perhaps draw a neat line from my discovery of the resistance literature of the Gulag archipelago to my developing a specialisation focused on post-colonial literatures of resistance emerging from the archipelagos of the Caribbean. I would need a unifying theme for that kind of story, and I might find it in literary geography, expanding from the real to the virtual, with research into the fictions and fantasies of micronations, which are invented nations, or rather, and unrecognised nations, and maybe even onward to my research on pirate utopias. Choosing that kind of story to tell, where the emerging geographic events of narrative fiction underscore the openness of not just hypertext, but every text, to multiple readings. I might even argue that academic knowledge production works in exactly that way. That is, it has to be open to contradiction. Otherwise, there can be no advance. But it's easy to get lost in the garden of forking paths. So, I'm going to take this path. I came back from the Soviet Union with two novels by the banned Russian emigre author Vladimir Nabokov, Glory and Despair. I wrote my dissertation on the idea of the superfluous man, a literary type I had discovered in reading back into 19th century Russian literature. The superfluous man, the very image of existential boredom, a character not unwanting in talent or capability, but who seems not to fit anywhere, and who, as David Patterson describes him, having lost a point, a balance, a presence in life, has little respect or no regard for social values. The beauty of that story is that I can see myself entering the discipline of English with a focus that epitomises and indeed prefers complete lack of discipline. But fortunately, I've chosen the most undisciplined discipline. For as I would discover, learning the discipline of English also means constantly unlearning it. English is the undisciplined discipline. It's not easily managed. Jenny can tell you. A typical response from unruly English academics to whatever latest management decree might be to point out that the word manage was a latecomer to English, only entering the language probably from the Italian in the late 16th century, where it meant control, as in the control of a horse. Though ultimately, of course, it derived from Latin. And this provides us with a clue as to why the manual, a literary genre barely recognised by the English discipline, is so central and beloved to management. English today is often said to be in crisis, doomed to irrelevance by the rise of a professional managerial class, by the ever-increasing communicative power of the new media, etc., etc. But English has almost always been in crisis. It is, as reported just last week in the Chronicle of Higher Education, the quintessential discipline in crisis. The sense of struggle has defined the discipline since the 19th century. We have been persistently either emergent or in decline. But reports of the death of English are predicated upon a narrative of rise and fall, like Bill Reading's account of the university in ruins, and is just as easily deconstructed. The truth for English is not the corruption of some previously pure ideal, like Gibbon's account of the decline of civic virtue in Rome leading to the barbarian invasions. The truth of English is that it's always been a discipline of competing conceptions and conflicting interior forces, as impure as the university itself. If we are to believe Christopher Newfield's recent account of the North American hybrid, ivy and industry. Those who seek to tie the discipline to a coherent ideology, such as the promotion of culture, or even to restrict its focus exclusively to one object of inquiry, most commonly literature, have missed the point. I'm not here in solidarity with my colleagues as the last of the true believers, and I'm sure that those who are here with me tonight are not here for that reason either. The discipline of English has always been impure, interdisciplinary. It's the pirate discipline, taking whatever it needs from whomever and whatever it wants. The earliest memory I have of high school English is of the teacher pacing back and forth before the class in a rage of speechless frustration and banging a book on his head repeatedly. What book was that? Animal Farm, 1984. I know at home I was reading Treasure Island, which established the genre of pirate fiction once and for all. We didn't have the parrot on the shoulder before that. But when this hapless English teacher posed that question that Eilish referred to, what do you want to do with your life? I, at least by this stage, knew better than to answer pirate or Indian. I told him I would be a university lecturer, and amazingly he didn't laugh or scorn the precociousness of that ambition, which in any case I had arrived at so spontaneously that it couldn't have shocked him more than it did me. What was I thinking? I had only the dimmest notion even of what a university was. And then to profess to an English teacher that I wanted to teach English, this was surely to fly in the face of even the most cursory risk analysis. And the risk was high. Crawling was a cardinal sin, and in any case, the passion for poetry needed to be kept well hidden if I were to avoid becoming a target of the regular blood sport of lunch and recess. Fortunately, the English teacher could be trusted. He kept the secret. In Foucault's study of the nature of power in modern society, the prison is key for understanding its operation, along with the school. But the defining characteristic of modern society, as Foucault sees it, is its disciplinary nature. As part of its training of individuals to take their place in that society, the school I attended managed any significant threat to student discipline, by boys at least, by means of corporal punishment. No doubt the disciplining of teachers was handled differently. Foucault links the coercive power of modern society specifically to ways of knowing that began to emerge in the 18th and 19th century with the birth of the academic disciplines of the human sciences, especially psychology. The training of English, however, while bound by the usual rules of assessment and examination, seemed little concerned for preparing and placing students in social hierarchies and shaping their expectations accordingly. Looking back to my own earliest experience of English as a discipline, it appears rather as the secret agent of insurrection. My most memorable English teacher, Mr. Markov, or Boris as we called him, taught me nothing about literature. But he gave me Stravinsky in my lunch hour. He took me to my first live rock concert. He gave me my first Italian meal. William Blake, Angela Davis, Abbie Hoffman, Bobby Seale, the Black Panther movement, the Chicago conspiracy trials, and the moratorium badge that I wore. English had to be the coolest subject. But later, when I was deciding on a topic for my master's dissertation, more than one English professor warned me to stay away from Australian English as a less legitimate object of study than English or even American literature, which would likely not provide me with a secure position in academic life. So by the time I embarked upon West African and West Indian literatures for my PhD, I was a lost cause to most of the English professoriate. Though I discovered an international community of like-minded rebels and exiles and formed lasting friendships and relationships in Jamaica, Trinidad, and other seemingly off-centre sites of English in the parts of the world once coloured red on the map. The discovery of the so-called new literatures, Caribbean, Indian and African literatures, was a revelation similar to that of crossing over to the adult side of the library in my childhood. My unofficial mentor, I want to acknowledge tonight, was Professor Dick Ewan, a Scot from Aberdeen who had taught English for 14 years in Sudan and later in Trinidad, and through whom I ended up doing my PhD in Canada. He was an anarchist whose chief literary interest was William Godwin, the author of an inquiry concerning political justice, one of the earliest texts of the anarchist philosophy. But he was also the author of the first mystery novel, The Adventures of Caleb Williams, which used the form of the novel as a means to attack the political system of the aristocracy. Husband to pioneering feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft, his daughter Mary Shelley was the author of Frankenstein and the wife of Dick's favourite poet. Godwin's theory of government, outlined in Political Justice, was that a society in which reason rather than law maintained the social balance should not require government. Private property would be abolished, and reason would dictate a just share for everybody. English, at the time Dick was teaching it at the University of Khartoum, however, was completely in harness to law rather than reason. I don't know whether you like that binary. Having been co-opted by the British government for the purpose of instilling a sense of English order and values in the students who would form the administrative class after independence. No subject played a more key role in British colonial education than English. And no educator was more important to nation building across the British Empire than the English teacher. In an attempt to preserve the southern Sudan from Islam and confine Arabism to the north, the British divided Sudan. And to a large degree, at least until the moment of independence, it was the discipline of English that provided the mechanism for maintaining that boundary. Gordon Memorial College, subsequently Khartoum University College, was the primary purveyor of English education in the Sudan. It preferred young men of high status backgrounds from Arab-speaking Muslim families of the central north, and it sought to initiate them into the culture of English as it prepared them for government, just as Lord Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education, produced over 100 years earlier, had envisaged creating in India a class of persons Indian in blood and colour, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals and intellect. Thus, English in the colonies and protectorates of empire, including Australia, can hardly be said to have been undisciplined, at least by its intent. But the British government had not reckoned on the anarchist spirit of its longest-serving agent of English at the University of Khartoum, Dick Ewan, who took advantage of his favourite poet, Shelley, to show his students an unflattering English vision of the yellow and black and pale, hectic red, pestilence-driven multitudes. At the same time, he gave them the revolt of Islam, Shelley's poetic vision of revolutionary idealism, and he instructed them in Shelley's belief that the only true joy and meaningful victory lay in the achievement of virtue, beauty and freedom, for these are the values, the achievements that give one control over life and death, the only imperial community that really matters. Having been forced out of Sudan by the October Revolution in 1964, then out of Trinidad by the Black Power movement, and finally settling in Canada, a nation that generally refuses definition except by its historical opposition to the American War of Independence, Dick Ewan arrived in Adelaide in 1979. I introduced him to the alcoholic pleasures of Coonawarra, the Southern Vales and the Clare Valley, and in the process I acquired a liking for good Scotch whisky. He shared my belief in the compatibility of social protest with aesthetic value, political and metaphysical vision, against the prevailing view that great art must transcend social forms and contexts and achieve the quality of the universal by speaking to all people in all places at all times. It's a critical ideology that, at the time, preferred Patrick White, say, to Xavier Herbert, on whom I was working, which ignored women's writing almost entirely, as well as all working class and indigenous literatures. It marginalised all the literature of struggle, most cruelly that of the formerly red parts of the map, where writers had had English language and literature pushed down their throats as part of their colonial education, only to be disqualified from serious attention subsequently by dint of their social concerns and the unorthodox nature of their literary procedures and linguistic usages. I introduced Dick to the man who loved children and Capricornia, and he opened my eyes to the world of Caribbean literature. And from there it's been a long journey, but a short step to this university town with its Scottish ancestry, its campus dominated by the big house Bulimimba, as the great houses of the West Indies once dominated their plantation surrounds, the famous Gordon window which dominates the entrance hall of the house, as General Gordon had hoped to conquer and rule Sudan before he quite literally lost his head to the Mahdi. And of course the perpetual deer park, where deer and kangaroo cohabit, a kind of third space of pastoral bliss, testimony to the creation of new transcultural forms within the contact zone. Thomas Brown spent a year here as the town magistrate before his literary career as Rob Calderwood author of the colonial classic Robbery Under Arms, which likens the bushranging hero Captain Starlight to a pirate captain. Less well known are two other novels, The Miner's Right, a hymn to the makeshift society of the Australian goldfields as a kind of pirate utopia, and A Modern Buccaneer, based on the life of the celebrated pirate Willie Hayes, which led to Louis Beck, Australia's preeminent author of pirate fiction, suing Brown, or Boulderwood, for plagiarism, a form of literary prospecting which many identify as piracy. Where better then than landlocked Armidale to begin researching piracy? One of my more pleasurable satisfactions since coming to UNE has come from injecting what I hope is a healthy fix of Aboriginal literature into our Australian literature curriculum. You might think that indigeneity could have little to do with piracy, but you would be wrong. The recent history of Aboriginal literature is littered with tales of identity theft, non-Indigenous authors claiming to be Aboriginal in order to gain specialised publication or to apply for Indigenous literary awards, like the Sydney Mail taxi driver Leon Carmen, who published under the name of Wanda Kulmatri a supposedly biographical account by a woman of the Pitjantjatjara people. On the other hand, in the 1920s, the white Australian press regularly presented tales of Indigenous plunder of shipping in Northern Australia as Aboriginal piracy. At that time, Xavier Herbert, struggling to make a name for himself as a writer prior to the publication of Capricornia, had gone to Northern Australia prospecting for a literary theme. One story he wrote, untitled and published posthumously in my collection of his short stories, South of Capricornia, gives a particular insight into how indigeneity and piracy came together in mainstream white Australia's anxieties about nation building at that time, just a few years after the Russian Revolution. The North in this story is a land of shadows, where a devil named Padrona has taken over, enslaving the local Indigenous people and binding them to his evil will, while plundering the coastal shipping to build up his reserves for the day when he can take over the entire world. This pirate captain is described as an educated half-caste, a term quite current at the time, and a maniac who hates all white men with the hatred of a demon. As part of his plunder, he even kidnaps scientists and tortures them for their secrets. He has thousands of rifles and vast supplies of ammunition. He has machine guns. He has mines placed along the coast to prevent invasion. And he has an army of Russians, Malays, Japanese, Hindus, communist and coloured, to help him. This is the pirate as ethnic terrorist, a spectre of white Australia's fear of a population of half-castes, as the mainstream press regularly warned, that had begun to outstrip that of the white population in the north, in numbers. The press also regularly reported that Aboriginal people in their natural state were communists, and the detribalised and destitute were considered easy prey to Communist Party agitators. It's not hard to see why Herbert's story remained unpublished. At the time it was written, it would have fanned the flames of white Australia's worst fears, the infiltration of a coloured army of liberation led by Trotsky's Red Brigade. The evil pirate regime he imagined taking over Northern Australia is a precise inversion of the progressive vision of development of the North, which he based on the true story of Bradshaw's Buccaneers. These were not pirates, despite the name. They were settlers, unless one took the Aboriginal view that they were followers of Captain Cook. Pirates are enemies of the state, whereas buccaneers are state-sponsored. Captain Joe Bradshaw was widely regarded as one of the great nation builders of the North. But the community of workers he'd established on his property, mostly the former ship's crew of the sailing vessel that had delivered him there in the first place, were a kind of international brigade, not unlike those the Communist Party would soon be recruiting to defend the Spanish Republic against General Franco's forces. Bradshaw's Buccaneers, kind of a Labour Party, were a collection of French, West Indian, Chinese, Spanish, Brazilian and of course Aboriginal workers. All went well until, in his absence, Captain Bradshaw appointed a Russian manager whose vicious tyranny and brutal treatment of Indigenous workers led to him becoming known as Ivan the Terrible. True story. Eventually, of course, there was an Aboriginal uprising in which the Russian was killed, along with several other European settlers. An incident that Ernestine Hill describes as one of the grimmest tragedies of the North. But who is the pirate here? From the point of view of the Spanish Empire in the 17th century, the Queen of England was the pirate queen. And men like Sir Walter Raleigh also were pirates, terrorising the Spanish state. The English point of view, of course, was otherwise, and remains so. Buccaneers were not pirates because their plunder and pillage of Spanish shipping was licensed by the British Crown. The title of Pirate Queen is generally reserved in British history for Elizabeth's Irish counterpart, Grace O'Malley. Elizabeth refused to marry. She was, she said, married to England, and so created for herself the persona of the Virgin Queen. And chastity is not commonly associated with piracy. Romance fiction frequently links the Queen, without much historical evidence, to her favoured courtier, Sir Walter Raleigh, who moved seamlessly between exploration and piracy. In Australia, from the 1870s, the Northwest was constantly reported as the Virgin North. This had a double meaning. It meant first that it was ripe for development. Second, that it needed protection, because it was the ideal space for an invasion. And if the enemy ever did occupy that territory, it would require an army 100 times stronger to expel them, an army that Australia didn't have. Paradoxically then, Bradshaw's Buccaneers and other pioneer settlers like them were seen as nation builders, developers, at the same time as they were seen as a kind of chastity belt against the real pirate Asian invasion. Aboriginal people were crucial to this way of thinking precisely because, in the eyes of the state, they had no agency of their own, and being communists by nature, they would be easily seduced by the pirate code. The multi-ethnic pirate commonwealth established by the Brethren of the Coast on the island of Tortuga in the Caribbean in the 17th century did have a code. In fact, they had a constitution, they had voting rights, and they had the beginnings of a welfare state with workers' compensation. The more serious the injury, the larger the payout. A man without a sword hand received the largest amount. That would mean he could no longer earn his living. An amputated leg brought less because you could still fight with a wooden leg. The Brethren also had a legal code, which, for example, criminalised theft. A first-time thief lost an ear or a nose. A repeat offender would be left marooned on one of the many tiny islands with a bottle of water, some bread, and a gun to end it all when the food and water ran out. From one point of view, these pirates formed a terrorist dystopia. From another, they were the forerunners of democracy in the Americas. As a demonstration of the link between colonialism, nation building and contemporary piracy, we need only think of the Somali pirate response to the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, offering to donate a significant share of their loot from US and European shipping to assist the recovery. The catch was that they refused to channel money through the usual aid agencies and distribution networks. They had their own alternative international network, they said, by which they would deliver the money undetected. These contemporary pirates, disputing the moral authority of Western nations, had already set about dismantling Somalia as a nation, and they saw Haiti, the poorest nation on earth and the spiritual home of piracy, and the rebuilding of Port-au-Prince after the earthquake as a symbol of their own efforts to build a new Tortuga from the wreckage of nation states. The Somali pirates argue that the US and Europe have been pirating humanity for centuries. Tortuga for them is a model of transnational resistance. But the pirates of the early modern period, like those of today, have become more difficult to distinguish over time. Indigenous people deprived of their original homelands now regard explorers such as Captain Cook and Columbus as pirates. And many explorers like Dampier and Drake were shapeshifters, pirates at one historical moment, explorers in another. In retrospect, pirates and explorers often seem like almost complementary formations of identity. The new age of discovery, though, is the genetic age. First world capitalist discourses call the search for supposedly unexploited genetic resources, as well as the collecting and patenting of these for profit, bioprospecting. Traditionally, of course, one prospects for gold or some other precious element, with the aim of improving one's own prospects. And the bioprospector is not much different, scanning for commercially valuable genetic and biochemical resources in the area most likely to offer a return, which are the areas of most concentrated biodiversity. Finding them, of course, he must register a claim to protect his own interests, and this means taking out a patent, probably on some indigenous plant, often a local food or a medicine source. To improve his bioprospects, that is the health, wealth and food security of the world, it represents the bioprospector might even patent human blood, tissue or DNA. It's not in the real interest of neoliberalism to share, but the best way to conceal that fact is to turn it back upon those who have the most to lose. Among those who might oppose the bioprospector's plunder, he reserves his most vigorous denunciation for those of a sharing persuasion. Castro in Cuba, Morales in Bolivia, Chavez in Venezuela, the new pirates of the Caribbean, as Tariq Ali has ironically named them. Who really is a pirate depends on a trick of perspective, for piracy can shift radically, shape, across different geopolitical thresholds, acquiring different definitions as it goes. Developing nations and indigenous peoples wishing to protect their resources from this kind of plunder have developed a counter-discourse to bioprospecting, which is that of biopiracy, to identify and combat what they regard as a virulent new strain of colonialism. As a mode of post-colonial counter-discourse, biopiracy finds its strongest articulation in those countries still struggling with the legacy of past forms of colonialism, and increasingly it finds its way into the ecological imaginings of post-colonial literatures as well. Pirates have been put to a myriad of different literary purposes over the past 300 to 400 years. The range of permutations in pirate prose fiction alone is vast. Yet the pirate novel is a genre rarely taken seriously by literary scholars, who have tended to see it as contaminated by the Orientalist glamour of exotic adventure and romance, and so have consigned it to the category of genre fiction. The rediscovery of children's writing as a legitimate object of inquiry has done little to add interest, but only because the original seriousness and shock horror of the adult pirate genre has, since the mid-19th century, until recently at least, given way to the comedy mode as an entertainment for young readers. The 20th century that gave us the new space pirate and was bookended by the ghost pirate and the vampire, has now exploded and is wide open. Pirate gold is now blue and green. The post-apocalyptic visions of recently published and only slightly speculative fictions have not really been recognised yet as variants of pirate fiction. But these novels, whatever their aesthetic value, and that varies enormously, are posing the age-old question, who is the pirate, in new and important ways? And that is the value of pirate fiction to the pirate discipline, English. Piracy was a crucial factor in the history of the book. After the birth of the printing press, it was piracy that drove the development of copyright law. That invention required the development of new policing strategies for the production and the reception of knowledge, which legitimised some authors and publishers, but made pirates of others. The pirates of the Caribbean were mostly illiterate. Nonetheless, they provided a model, thinking about property theft and redistribution in the early modern world. And in this way, the pirate became a crucial figure for understanding the production and circulation and reception of literature as a category of culture, which is to say, writing that is deemed to have value. English, as an undisciplined discipline, is edgy and sometimes even dangerous, as any cursory survey of the modern campus novel since the 1950s will show. The majority of professorial crimes in that genre have been committed by and perpetrated against English professors. Elizabeth Showalter, who wrote the book on this genre, appropriately titled Faculty Towers, regards it as an important precursor to the Handbook of Self-Help Guide, the Handbook or Self-Help Guide for graduate students and junior faculty. The academic novel, according to this view, serves the honourable purpose of teaching us how to be a proper professor, how one should speak, behave, dress, think, write, love, and often solve murders. My advice to new members of staff is to go back to the precursor. The most popular subspecies of the genre before its corporate translation into an academic self-help manual is the campus crime novel, with titles like Death in a Tenured Position, Poison Ivy, Murder is Academic, and our own celebrated UNE exemplar, Death of an Old Goat. Most authors of academic crime novels are or have been English professors, mostly female. The murder victims are mostly male, and mostly of the discipline English. For a new middle-aged male professor, therefore, this genre can be deeply troubling. But in other ways, it is also deeply revealing. For English is the undisciplined discipline. With apologies to my colleagues in philosophy, then allow me to conclude very logically. I wanted to be a pirate. I became a professor of English, which is to say, in all of its rich ambiguity,